The actual idea of prisoners of war has become heavily romanticized in recent years, with books, movies, and shows all illustrating daring escapes and defiance in the face of failure and capture. And for sure, there is a certain romanticism to it. A prisoner of war is by definition not someone who is being held for actual crimes, rather an allegiance to their country. Such ideas that have permeated popular culture, such as the dashing British officer declaring his intention to return to the fight by any means necessary, and the old German commander disconnected from the crimes of his nation by virtue of his position, beholden to the idea of a gentleman's war, respecting the duty to escape, and fighting an old battle. Or perhaps the Italian commandant, who swings his gates open, finding more in common with the soldiers he is keeping prisoner than the marauding Germans who are rolling through his country. More popular still, the image of the defiant American airman who against all odds will survive the brutality of his internment by the Japanese. And understandably, it is incredibly emotive, a battle of wits and respect between prisoner and commander, one trying to escape and one trying to prevent escape. Aside from the fact this is sadly largely fictional, with no allied forces having a so-called duty to escape, and internment being seen, at least on the Western Front, as a decently cushy life. In fact, there are many recorded instances of senior British officers reporting men for trying to escape, or preventing escapes themselves, all just to keep order in the camps. And it is here we see a small glimpse of the past. A past that we will be looking at today. Because you might be surprised to know, despite the Geneva Convention and international law only notarizing many aspects of prisoner of war rights in the last century or so, the practice has existed in much the same form in European warfare for centuries. And now, all introductions aside, let's begin. This is the story of prisoners of war in the age of Napoleon's Europe. If you've been here for any other installment in this series, you know I like to refer to the experiences of Wellington's army. But in this video, it's a little different. Firstly, everything here applies to most combatants. But more surprisingly, it's apt to not refer to Wellington's army, but rather Nelson's navy. Soldiers were indeed taken prisoner, but in slightly lesser quantities than sailors, at least from the British perspective, which we'll be drawing from. In one instance, in 1812, 9 soldiers were held captive in a prison containing over 1,000 sailors. See, Napoleonic warfare usually resulted in the rout or retreat of one force. Such overwhelming victories as Austerlitz, where much of the Austrian and Russian forces were captured, were both rare and usually led to quick releases of prisoners, as such devastating land defeats would lead to capitulation, and thus quick prisoner exchanges. For seamen, however, this was uncommon. Especially as Britain practically held an unbroken chain of hostility with France for over a decade on either side of the peace in 1803. British sailors captured after the breaking of the Peace of Amiens could expect to be held until war's end in 1814 if they were unlucky. But we're perhaps getting a bit too ahead of ourselves. How did the system actually work? First of all, the French Revolutionary Wars were something completely new for Europe. Not only did it introduce a completely new style of warfare ushered in by the mass mobilisation of the French state, both in manpower with the levée en masse, but also industrially with the government-sponsored centralisation of arms workshops all over the nation. However, the egalitarianism that started this was also something that fundamentally changed the experience of prisoners of war, creating a system that perhaps would not survive Napoleon's rise to power, but would leave its influence to this day. Previous to the revolution, something called the cartel system was commonplace in Europe. Soldiers and sailors would be gathered up en masse and attributed a strict financial value according to their rank. They would then be swapped for the equivalent value of the other nation's men. The financial aspect of this cannot be overstated, as it very much influenced the treatment of men based on social status and rank. Officers were expected to hold a much higher value on their own honour and were often thus offered a parole of honour. This would be a simple pledge to not take up arms against the nation that took them prisoner until they were deemed officially cartelled, and they were often free to make their own way home and released relatively quickly. For the lower ranks, the process was quite a bit more arduous. They would have to wait until a relatively large amount, usually in the hundreds, were gathered together. Only then was their collective value high enough to be swapped. But in the revolutionary era, the system seems to have faltered in a few main ways. Cartels still persisted, but the practice seems to change form, depending on which account you read. Some officers, such as one Thomas O'Neill, explained the French, due to egalitarianism of revolution, had scrapped differential treatment altogether, and in some instances the officers were treated worse than common men. Thrown in cells with normal soldiers and sometimes killed as an example. This type of reporting, however, must be taken with a grain or a heap of salt, as O'Neill also engages in almost hilariously vitriolic rants against the French, and his account was published soon after Britain had resumed hostilities with France. Another account by one Sir Sidney Smith is particularly shocking, as it highlights how he was treated as an enlisted man, not an officer. The outrage that this caused domestically seems to highlight the rarity of such cases. Many other accounts noted that the French, despite the equality of their revolution, still offered parole to officers, and they were given favourable treatment. But back to the cartels. Well, they did continue under the revolutionary system for a time, with one sad account demonstrating this. One George Mackay, a first-class boy of age 15, was captured in 1794, and noted that in true fashion, the sailors of his ship had broken into the spirit room when faced with the appearance of French vessels, and they got blisteringly drunk and were taken prisoner shortly thereafter. The reason they did not put up a fight? They wished to protect the prize money they had just won, presumably from their own captures. They were then marched over 100 miles to Livorno, where money from a British prize agent was waiting for them, a man whose job it was to arrange prisoner exchanges. What is interesting is they were allowed free rein in the town of Gap, something relatively uncommon for enlisted men. He attempted to escape 2 times, as during his stint of being a prisoner, cartels had broken down. He was kept for over a year. On his second escape attempt, he was recaptured, only to find his old crew had just been cartelled. It was only in 1798 he was able to escape, where he was instantly picked up by a navy ship and press-ganged back into service. The French revolutionary government were under a lot of scrutiny for their treatment of prisoners. It had been found they had broken cartel and were in debt equivalent to around 3,000 men. On top of this, they had been found withholding food or providing alcohol to sailors in an attempt to make them sign on to the French Navy, in which they succeeded to the tune of around 500 men. This was not illegal per se, but it was heavily frowned upon. And I think that's a perfect segue to talk about what I believe to be on everyone's mind. Why? Why did nations even bother keeping prisoners of war? Well, for a long time prisoners had been regarded as the property of their captor, harkening back to the practice of slavery after conflict, which was a mainstay of practically every culture at one point or another. On top of this, in the Middle Ages, when armies were not controlled by what we now know as the modern state, but rather individuals within the complex aristocracies of Europe, prisoners were again seen as a rightful prize, a spoil of war, either through enslavement in earlier years or in certain geographies, or through ransom in later periods. By the point of the 30 Years' War, however, as conflict became increasingly the business of states, not individual warlords, dukes, princes and kings, prisoners thus became the property of the state, and were afforded protections befitting their new status. The Peace of Westphalia, the end of the 30 Years' War, included clause that prisoners be released when conflict is over. This, obviously far predating agreements such as the Geneva Conventions, was incredibly rough, but outlined basic privileges and rights for prisoners of war. But for the most part, nations were bound by the simple fact that if you have some enemies held captive, it stands to reason they also probably have some of your guys. In fact, many of the positive remarks we will make on prisoners of war and their experiences stem from the simple fact that Britain had a lot more Frenchmen than the French had Brits. And as a consequence, British prisoners lived under a much more controlled, bureaucratic, and forgiving regime than basically any continental soldier. A Russian or an Austrian taken prisoner was very unlikely to be treated nearly as well as a simple Jack Tar, who, by the way, were not treated well at all. For the sole reason the Russians and Austrians didn't have that many Frenchmen to boot. On top of this, the Spanish suffered perhaps the worst fate of all of those captured, partly due to the fact French prisoners were treated quite horribly by the Spanish, which did not curry much favour with the establishment to treat Spanish soldiers any better, and partly because Napoleon himself said as follows. Also, that the prisoners must be sent to France, retaining the Germans, Swiss, and French to serve in my army, but that no Spaniard must be employed. They are habitual traitors. In one instance, 12,000 Spaniards taken prisoner were sent on a march northwards, and they were dying at a rate of up to 300 to 400 a day. They were to be put to work building roads and fortifications all over France. One British account highlights this difference, and the French reluctance to acknowledge it in the presence of their better treated British captives. We passed some Spanish and Austrian prisoners, escorted by cavalry, many of them without shoe or stocking. They were chained together, and we were informed that when fatigue or sickness caused them to advance with difficulty, they were most cruelly beaten to urge them on. We were not permitted to look round the town, and our gendarmes did not like us to speak to the Spanish officers. This was again further exacerbated by the aforementioned breakdown of prisoner exchanges. When Wellington took 20,000 Frenchmen captive, he was ordered to send no more to England, as they simply did not have the facilities to hold them. No large-scale swaps were taking place from 1803 to 1814, but as we can see from one personal arrangement between Soult and Wellington, where 2 Spaniards and 1 British soldier would be exchanged for every 3 French soldiers, attempts were made. This was, however, a distinctly local agreement, and did nothing to alleviate the stress on British prisons, such as the Navy hulks with their terrifying conditions, nor the many British servicemen held in France herself. Now that we had clearly established that such conventions around prisoners of war were more suggestions enforced by threat of retaliation, we can finally get into the meat of things. It's taken us a while. And here our story takes 2 very distinct paths, one for the officer and one for the enlisted man. Let's start with officers, because their story is perhaps quite strange, but don't worry, we'll get into the gritty life of the enlisted man soon enough. And there is still the story of the yet unspoken 3rd class of prisoner, but all in due time. Officers were, as a whole, always treated better than their lowly counterparts in the enlisted ranks, but deviances in treatment existed even still. The basic tenets of treatment for an officer were as followed. They would not be held in the prison, but rather would be allowed to roam free, either in an open-air prisoner's town like Verdun, or a genuine French town itself. They would be allowed to retain property and own French land, and for all intents and purposes live like a French citizen. In fact, in many southern towns and cities, officers who had been taken prisoner provided a vital cash injection into local economies. Officers still received their pay while captured and had little to spend it on. The only real divergence from a well-off French citizen seems to be they had the onus to check in with a parole officer once or twice a week. And speaking of parole, this was how officers were afforded such treatment. They would pledge to not attempt an escape or engage in any subversive acts against the state they were captured by, and in turn this would be taken at face value, and for good reason. In fact, we have reason to believe this was treated as a fate worse than death for the officers who broke their parole. To break parole was to break a gentleman's honour, and as such he could no longer be trusted in any official capacity, even by his own nation. He was now no longer a gentleman. If an officer was serious enough about his military duty to attempt an escape under parole, he would find no duty to return to. He would be in most cases stripped of commission in the army or removed from his ship in the navy and de-ranked. Of course, parole was optional. It could be denied an officer for good reason, and in turn it could be denied by an officer. In this, an officer could choose to not give his word of honour, and thus he would be treated like an enlisted man. And some did do this, but most didn't. The higher up a man was in the military chain, the more ludicrous his situation became. One man, Major General Thomas, Lord Blaney, Baron of Monaghan, was treated with a level of regard we would see as more in tune with an esteemed foreign diplomat than a prisoner. He had a seemingly personal friendship with Marshal Bessières when he was held captive, dining with the man and even being given a substantial loan by the Marshal. He seemed so assured of his status that it's remarked he had the confidence to criticise the food of the many dinners held by the French in his honour. He was able to use his considerable influence to negotiate better conditions for the more lowly officers. But there was a dark undertone. He was still, of course, a prisoner. He seemed to outstay his welcome at Bordeaux, being threatened with the revocation of parole if he didn't move along. He did, but it still took him 6 months to reach Paris, travelling France seemingly as a tourist. Although when news reached France of the comparatively bad treatment of one of their own generals, Blaney was placed under arrest and held in an actual prison for once. This would only last around 7 weeks before normalcy returned. And Blaney was once again an oxymoronic example of the free prisoners of England's gentleman class. It is of course important that not everyone was afforded this kind of treatment just on the merit of their status. For many, especially the men of lower officer ranks, had to, in a sense, create their own luck. One Royal Engineer, Captain Boothby, lost a leg in the fighting in Spain. He was left behind by the army and took great efforts to secure his personal effects. But he needn't have bothered. Picked up by 2 French captains, he was treated exceptionally well, due to the fact that the English for a long while had been practicing a policy in which they protected French prisoners from the unpredictable and often cruel Spanish irregular and regular forces. Again, we can see here many hints of the type of agreement POW practice was based on: mutual friendship, and if all else fails, mutual destruction. Boothby then went on to have an almost stupidly easy time of the whole prisoner thing. He became fast friends with Marshal Mortier, remarking the following: "On taking leave, he gave me a letter addressed to Marshal Jourdan, in which he recommended me strongly to the good offices of the Commander-in-Chief, repeating his application for my exchange, or for my early and commodious conveyance to France, in order to further an object so desirable for my unfortunate situation. In short, though sensible of how much a noble mind deems due to the unfortunate, I was at a loss to conceive how I could have deserved such kindness and aid from the Marshal Duke of Treviso, as would in all points have become the affection of a near relation." Boothby then travelled France under the pay of Mortier and the protection of his generals, eventually landing in Paris and personally petitioning Napoleon for a cartel, an incredibly rare occurrence but one that is successful. Boothby returned home to England in 1810, exchanged for a French captain. Not all officers lived in such luxury or had equivalent adventures. Some, like one Captain Brenton, experienced ill treatment at the hand of his captors. He didn't make life easy for himself either, constantly scheming and petitioning for better food and conditions for the enlisted prisoners of his area. He demanded money from the Admiralty, drew subscriptions from the détenus, who were usually incredibly wealthy civilian prisoners, and even drew personal loans to pay for the many schemes he initiated, from gainful employment for prisoners to education. Even once he rented a large townhouse and moved prisoners under his charge from their terrible conditions, and he housed them. Britain was perhaps the greatest advocate for the common man during the entire war. He made strident efforts to improve the lives of captured men in France, challenging French authorities all the way. The contrast with the comfortable life of Blaney is more than obvious. But again, it must still be noted that he was an officer and was treated as such. When Marshal Massena's own nephew was captured, the British offered a trade, but they would only accept one man in exchange: Brenton. And of course, as to be expected, some officers, especially the lower ranks, tended to their imprisonment in almost a comedic fashion. One man, Lieutenant Ewell, and his companion, Lieutenant Bingham, rented a small house in Verdun, and their sole pride and joy in the world seemed to be making their little garden the envy of all their French neighbours. Sadly, however, the lives of enlisted men is slightly more hazy to us. Accounts of course do exist, and they're plentiful, but they're often more fractured and inconsistent. We have stories of some men being given leave to roam smaller towns where they make up a sizable chunk of the population, but most men were held in downright terrifying conditions. Food was inconsistent, and as the war drew on, starvation conditions were not entirely uncommon. At the turn of the 19th century, captured men were given rations comparative to those they received while serving, namely a pound of beef. And if you watched my previous video, you'll understand that soldiers' rations were hardly very good at the best of times. Ironically though, Napoleon drew criticism for his policy of feeding prisoners. Not for feeding them too little, however. Despite not being fed particularly well, it was noted that to keep the standard of the British, prisoners were being fed in many instances more than French soldiers in active duty. This is kind of misleading though, as of course the French didn't rely on traditional rations in the same way the British did. If you want a fuller explanation, go see my last video. The situation deteriorated somewhat as time went on. Deteriorated, not deteriorated. It became not uncommon for soldiers to be given a half pound of beef, and calling it beef would be incredibly generous. Often it would be a mishmash collection of liver, heads, intestines, and other nutritionally deficient parts of the cow. Soldiers' experiences relied almost totally on their personal wealth. Of course, this wasn't going to be much, but money was being constantly raised by the public in Britain to send to the men. But oftentimes it was remarked that such money never reached the prisoners, switching hands so many times that inevitably some unscrupulous officer or charity worker would pocket the lion's share. This was further exacerbated by the fact that most relief schemes used the vast network of civilian prisoners in France to distribute funds, given their relative freedom. However, as one midshipman remarked, these men were nothing but criminals in their home country. It was in the hands of hostages, and distributed among a set of rascals who never dared show their faces in their native land again for fear of the gallows. One fellow received 2 guineas per month, a noted highwayman, whose arm had been broke by a gentleman whom he wanted to rob and escaped by flight to the continent. Obviously by the continent here he means France. This inevitably pitted the prisoner nearly completely at the mercy of their jailers. The chaplain of prisoners of France, Reverend Wolfe, had this to say about conditions in the jails. I found the depot in the most deplorable state. Both in a moral and physical point of view, it would be difficult to conceive anything more degraded and miserable. So great was their distress at that moment that, unable to satisfy the craving of hunger, they were seen to pick up the potato peelings that were thrown out into the court. Devour them. The little money that was received by the prisoners, instead of being applied to the relief of their wants and to make them more comfortable in food and clothing, was spent in riot and excess. On these occasions, sailors are, of all other men, most ready to communicate and never think of tomorrow. Often, the most dangerous part of a prisoner's experience was actually getting to the prisons. Especially the case for sailors, they would be marched from port to prison over distances of hundreds of miles. Often they were at the mercy of French civilians, who would provide food in exchange for money. What would usually be a simple arrangement became hostile, as often the men were scalped on prices. One woman was remarked as having charged so much for food it shocked even the French guards to the bone. But the men had little other option. On one march the inevitable happened. The sailors were remarked as having the clothes hanging off their body, looking starved and unshaven. They were a miserable sight. They, however, resorted to the traditional respite: alcohol. Spending the last of their money on brandy, the column became deplorably drunk. But as it was said, sailors march better drunk than sober. And if anything, at least it offered them some escape from their wretched post. In traditional sardonic fashion, one man writes in response to the ridicule the French offered his sailors, "They forget they were casting a severe reflection on their own navy, to be so often beat by such miserable-looking wretches." Prisoners had hunger, starvation and boredom to keep them busy, but many still decided to try and escape. Of course, enlisted men were not allowed parole, and as such, almost in trade for their wretched conditions, were afforded the opportunity to attempt escape without repercussion in their home country. However, it must be noted that escape as a concept was relatively new, of course, as the aforementioned cartel system had existed for over a century, and the Napoleonic Wars was the first large-scale conflict in which escaping was the primary method of freedom for many. It, of course, would not be the last, however. While hundreds escaped over the course of the war, many of these were not enlisted men, but in fact, midshipmen. Midshipmen occupied a strange position in the hierarchy of the Navy. They were socially gentlemen, but not really officially officers. This meant that midshipmen getting parole was quite literally up to the individual jailers. Often, a single midshipman could be given parole after months or years of treatment as an ordinary prisoner. They were also in a strange position, as they had money due to their class, but not nearly enough. They had too much to be able to spend and use in prison, but too little to survive on parole. Often midshipmen, even if they gained parole, would give it up. Escape was their only option. This was aided by the fact that many of them even spoke French. One group of midshipmen escaped dressed up as women, and happily it was reported back that they had made it to England. One duo was not so lucky. Haywood and Gale had been hiding in a cave after an escape in 1808. When they were discovered, Haywood was cut down and stabbed repeatedly until he died, and Gale was brutally injured. Haywood's body was then brought up to the prison, stripped naked, and left as a warning against escape. There are many such stories, and they're all worth a video in their own right, but sadly, there's just not enough time. As for the third class of prisoner, the citizens, we have only alluded to, well, they might have to wait. I've kept you here long enough. But please, before you go, I'd like to mention my Patreon. I know, of course. I'm a new and small channel, and as such, it can often be a little bit of a struggle to consistently make content. If you'd like to be part of the journey, of course, you don't have to be. Just watching is enough. I really hope this is just the beginning. Join my Patreon in the description. The lowest tier is only $1, and it has a fair few perks. And if you could, please subscribe. The recent growth has been immense and really supportive. Thank you all. Until next time.